Hi Dreamers! After over 2 years in Dreams, I've compiled all of my knowledge about sculpting. This tutorial has 7 parts. What is Dreams Sculpting? Sculpting Tools menu with the basics and the use cases. The Sculpting Guides menu, basics and the use cases. Component shapes reorganized in a different way to help you think about sculpting. Texturing. And then at the end, I talk about my workflows in 3D and 2D sculpting. I've placed chapters on this video, so you can skip to the 7 parts by clicking timestamps in the description, or you can use the chapters shown on the YouTube player. So now, let's get into the ultimate sculpting guide. I hope it's helpful. Part 1. Sculpting Fundamentals. Dreams Sculpting is built on SDF, or Signed Distance Fields. Basically what that means is math is used to create shapes in 3D space. And these shapes, because they are described by mathematical fields, can now interact with each other in ways that is very artistic. In Dreams, this is taken to the extreme. We have all kinds of properties that we can adjust on shapes, and this will affect the overall shape that we create. Some of these properties include blend, mirror, kaleidoscope, looseness, and there's so many others. All shape properties are inherent to the shape that is created, and cannot be changed once the shape is placed. A new shape with new settings must be placed if the settings need to be different. This is a mistake that I see people make. They'll place down a shape with certain settings, and then they'll go into their menu and switch some settings, and then they'll clone the shape around, thinking that switching those settings now applies to that shape. This is an area of confusion for a lot of people. They get confused why the shape that they're cloning around is not taking the properties that they've just changed in their menus. And the reason for that is you must stamp a new shape with new properties in order to apply the settings that you've changed. To help with this, there's a shortcut. If you have no tool or shape selected with your imp, you can press X on open space, and that will bring out the most recently used shape that you had. Then you can edit it how you want before stamping it down. Because of the inherent nature of shape properties that are stamped into the scene, sometimes what I like to do is create a palette with different properties on different shapes, and then I can clone them into the sculpture. This helps with a variety of different workflows, so you should try it at some point. It's pretty helpful. Another useful shortcut for changing shape properties is resetting them. You can do that by clicking the shape again. Then it will reset all of the changes that you have done to that shape. Another important feature in Dreams is negative shapes. Not only can you add shapes, you can also remove them. Another property of shapes is color. Shapes can also have a color when they're stamped in. Also, to match colors from Dreams, you can have your imp just out in the open and press touchpad. And then that will take up the color wheel. But you can also use your imp and hover on any color in the scene, press X, and now you have that color. Part 2, the Sculpting Tools menu. From left to right, there are a bunch of tools that you can use in the Tools section of the Sculpt node. First, there's the Undo tool. It's better to just use the left and right D-pad on the controller to undo, so you won't need to select this tool. Next, the Move tool. You don't need to select that either. For example, if you have a shape in your imp already and you want to get to the Move tool, you can just press circle, and you can see on the imp that I now have the Move tool selected. The next tool is the Stretch tool. You're going to want to use the stretch tool to stretch shapes in one direction at a time. Some things to remember about the stretch tool is that the shape needs to be able to be grabbed in order for you to stretch it. So for example, if I take a negative cutout of this sphere, I can only grab it in the place where it intersects with the positive shape. So I won't be able to grab the right side of this negative shape, so I can't stretch it from that edge. I can only stretch it from the place where it intersects. The stretch tool is also useful for aligning shapes to the grid. If you have the grid on, you can click on edges and they will snap to the grid. So you can align specific edges of shapes to the grid one at a time with the stretch tool. Next on the list is the clone tool. And the clone tool is useful in the menu, but there's also a shortcut of L1 plus R2 for cloning, so you don't really need to use the clone tool at all either. Next is the delete tool. Like some of the other tools, you can just press triangle. There's a shortcut for deleting. But now we get into the actual tools that make a huge difference. These 4 tools: stamp, smear, spray paint, and looseness. These are the backbone of sculpting. Let's start with stamp. What stamp does is it just places a shape, one at a time. Then there's smear, which actually creates a line of shapes that follow your imp cursor. As you can imagine, it's pretty hard to get specific shapes with a gyro controller. So smear isn't necessarily the most useful for creating base shapes, but it is good for texturing and coloring. It's good for complex shapes that require a smear. And there are some edge cases for stylistic sculpting that smear is actually better than stamp for. Next, we have spray paint. And spray paint affects the color of sculptures. You use a invisible shape, but when you overlap it onto the sculpture, you can see that it changes the color within the area of the shape. So you can recolor parts of your sculpture with spray paint. There are limits to this, especially if you want to be very precise and only color parts but not others. So I recommend that when you stamp or smear, that you have the correct color chosen, because if you do that, then you won't have to worry about spray painting very carefully to get clean edges between different colors. A thing to note about spray paint is that the Dreams default background very strongly skews the colors, and this is most apparent when you take out yellow. The yellow looks almost green, and that's because the Dreams sky is very blue. So when you're sculpting, it's a good idea to turn on studio lighting so that you can see actually how the colors look. When spray painting, you have some options. You get to these options with L1 and square, just like how you got to the shape editor for stamp and smear. First, soft blend. Soft blend will blend out the spray paint. You also have whole, just like with the shapes. And you have opacity as well, so you can lower the opacity of the spray. Keep in mind that when you spray, Dreams will continually put more shapes. So you might need to lower the opacity more than you think because of how many of these shapes are being placed at once. It'll end up being a larger opacity than the one shape that you're working with. There's also a grip. So you can grab shapes by different points so that the effect is different. This is especially useful with shapes like the cone, where you can use the grip on the edge of the cone to spray paint triangles wherever you want. And that works because you're grabbing the tip of the cone, and the cross-section will be a triangle. Next on the menu is the looseness tool. The looseness tool is mostly used for optimization. Every shape in Dreams has a sculpture detail. Sculpture detail is a unit of how many flecks are placed on the surface of the shapes that you put down. In Dreams, there are no polygons. There is only shapes, and they are covered in flecks. You can see them if you look closely. And then, if you increase the looseness, you can see that those flecks become larger. And that means there's less detail in the sculpture. And the looseness tool allows you to have local looseness. What most people are familiar with is something called the Adjust Detail tool. That's not in Sculpt mode, it's just in the regular Tools menu. And this allows you to change the looseness on an entire sculpture at one time. Very convenient. But for certain optimization cases, for example, a tile floor where the bottom is never seen, you can use the looseness tool to remove the detail on the bottom of the floor so that you can save on optimization. Things that are not ever seen don't need to have high detail. Another useful case with the looseness tool is if you have some unwanted mistakes in the shape of your sculpture, you can up the looseness on that area to kind of hide those mistakes. Next on the list are the crop and cutout tools. Crop will take the shape on your imp and it will remove everything that is not in the shape. So you can highlight some of the sculpture, press R2, and then the sculpture will now only contain the things that were inside the shape. Cutout does a similar thing, just like crop, but it retains all of the shapes that were outside of your imp, and it creates a new sculpture and puts them into that new sculpture. So you can separate sculptures into different pieces. It's important to be very careful when you use these tools, because you can create some hard edges with the crop and cutout tools that, as we'll see later in the tutorial, will be very difficult to manage. The best way to separate a sculpture without creating unwanted geometry is to just go into the sculpture and delete the things that you don't want. And we'll see later with the grid that you can even clone the sculpture, delete parts of it, and then you can have different parts of the same sculpture in different sculptures. Part 3, Guides. Guides should always be the first thing that is considered with every new sculpture. The reason for this is that guides cannot be moved once a sculpt is created. The very first shape that you stamp down determines both the mirror and the kaleidoscope. And once that shape is stamped, there is no moving it. The only way to change it is to remove all of the shapes in the sculpture and place a new one. So depending on the symmetry of the object that you're trying to sculpt, you're going to want to plan around where your mirror and kaleidoscope is on the very first thing that you do when you create a new sculpture. Now let's go through the actual guides themselves. First, I'll talk about the guides that affect stamping and smearing. These include mirror and kaleidoscope. The mirror cuts the sculpture in half and then mirrors everything that you stamp and smear along a plane that is shown on the screen. And the clipped mirror makes it so that anything that crosses the line of the mirror is not replicated on the other side. It's removed. And so you can create some interesting shapes with clipped mirror as well. Next, there's kaleidoscope. And kaleidoscope has rotational symmetry around a point on your sculpture, which is the center of the first shape that you placed. Guides also work in conjunction with each other. My favorite way to use guides together is with mirror and kaleidoscope of 2. This combination is great for creating tiles. Now let's talk about surface snap and tentacle snap. Basically, this just affects how your imp moves on the screen. With surface snap on, your shapes will snap all the way to the first surface that is found. So you can create shapes along a surface. This is especially useful for texturing work. Tentacle snap is similar to surface snap in that it places your imp on the first surface, but the difference with tentacle snap comes into play with smearing. Because once you start a smear, the tentacle snap releases the placement of the imp on the surface. So you can start a smear from a surface and extend it outwards. Great for grass, kelp, and other natural occurrences that start from the ground. Next, I'll talk about stay upright, because it interacts with surface snap. On its own, stay upright just keeps the shape upright, which is exactly what it says. There's also the option to do like right angles, so you can have the shape spin on one axis but stay upright on other axes. But if you combine surface snap and stay upright, what actually happens is that the shape will stay upright relative to the orientation of the surface that your imp is hovering. So you can easily create things that stick straight out from the surface. The other guides have to do with movement. Let's start with precise move. Precise move allows you to move component shapes in specific axes, X, Y, and Z. And this adds a little bit more precision to your movement so that you're not accidentally moving up or down if you only want to move in one direction, left or right, just as an example. Precise move also has an option of changing to local space. And what this means is if a shape is turned in an unconventional way, you can still move with respect to that shape by turning on local space. And then we come to grid. And grid is something that a lot of people misunderstand. So I'm going to talk about what is grid useful for, what is grid not useful for, and some workarounds that make grid even more useful than what people know. First of all, what is grid actually used for? The most common example of a use for grid is keeping a central point. Sometimes when you stamp a giant circular shape, it's pretty hard to eyeball where the center is. But if that shape was stamped on grid, you can find the center. Another useful application of grid is aligning multi-clones on grid. So if I grab this shape from the center and then I clone it, you can see that the grid kept the movement of my shape along one axis. Also, each of the clones are placed on the grid. Of course, if you make too many clones, they won't all be on grid, but it's still useful to know that I can have some shapes on grid even as clones. Another useful application of grid is for temporary displacement. So for example, if I want to separate parts of a sculpture and then bring the sculpture back together, I can temporarily shift something over on grid, edit, and remove pieces, and then I can move it back. Temporary displacement is useful for a lot of things, but that's just one example. Temporary displacement on the grid is also useful for resetting what is called the shape order. So basically, when you stamp shapes, and you use a negative shape, and you try to put a positive shape down, you'll see that the positive shape overwrites that negative shape. That's because the positive shape I'm about to stamp is the newest shape, so it will be placed over everything. But if I want to reset that order and make sure that this negative shape cuts into the new shape, I can clone on grid to reset the shape order and make that negative shape actually the newest shape, so it will cut into everything. It can also be useful to take shapes out of the sculpture off to the side so that you have them for later. And you can do this on grid without having to worry about being able to line it back up later. So what is grid not useful for? And this is pretty much everything that inexperienced users try to use it for. So aligning a very complex shape with many shapes to grid will not work because there's so many shapes and some of them just can't all be on grid. They're in different areas, they have different placements, and some of them weren't placed on grid. So you can't align specific points of the sculpture to a grid. For example, this little tentacle here, I can't align this specific part to the grid because each sculpture has its own grid alignment. So anything that's not on grid within a sculpture can't be chosen specifically, and you can't tell Dreams align the entire sculpture to this specific point. Grid is very technical, and it won't be flexible in the ways people want, but that doesn't mean it's not useful. You can still use grid in the ways I've described before. One of the most frustrating parts about grid is the resizing is incremental. There is no continuous resizing. Each time you press up or down on the D-pad, the shape increases in size or decreases in size by a fixed amount. And getting those in-betweens can be very difficult. It's still possible to get these in-between sizes. You can clone a shape and then resize it, and then if you multi-clone, the shapes in between will be in between the sizes that you just resized. So if you make many multi-clones, you can get these in-between shapes, and they can still be on grid. Temporary displacement on grid is also useful when you consider a trick with connectors for stretching complex sculpts. So for example, I have this sculpt with a bunch of component shapes. I can clone it on grid and make sure it's aligned, and create 2 clones so that there's 3 shapes. I can then go into the Gadgets menu and get a connector, specifically a ball joint. Then, from left to right, I connect one ball joint from the leftmost to the middle, and then I create another ball joint from the middle to the rightmost. Then, I go into the Tools menu, and I select the Stretch tool. This is not the same stretch tool as in Sculpt mode, it's in the regular Tools menu. Then, I can stretch the sculpts out, and you can see that the center sculpt is being stretched along one axis. Part 4. Shapes by Edge Qualities. One of the limitations of FDF sculpting in Dreams has to do with hard edges, and specifically how they blend together. Once a hard edge is created, there's no soft way to incorporate it into the other shapes. And so it's impossible pretty much to remove a hard edge, even with blend. The shapes that have hard edges include the cylinder, the cone, the wedge, the hexagon, the pyramid, and the cube. Using these shapes, especially for creating base shapes, is something that should be done intentionally. Or not at all. Because once you create a hard edge in your sculpture, there's no way to remove it. Believe me, I've tried. I've tried all kinds of things, including cutting many clones of negative shapes around a curve. And although this will alleviate some of the problems, there'll still be a hard edge somewhere. So hard edges should be used very intentionally. There are also some other shapes that don't have hard edges. These include the sphere, the donut, filled donut, the rounded cube, and the curve tool. I'd like to talk a little bit more about the curve tool. There are two buttons on the right of your UI when using the curve tool. The first one is Stamp in Place. This is great for adjusting curve either on grid or off of grid, and then maintaining the position that you edit it in. The second tool here is called Reset Shape. This preserves the size of the curve, but removes all the edits done to the points on the curve. And this is great for creating long wires or connected curves of the same size. I can edit the curve, stamp it, and then you can see that the curve is not placed in the proper location. So I can reset the shape, line it up either on grid or off grid, and then I can go back in and create a new shape. And this is great for connecting curves together so that you get more than just 4 points to work with. Curves aside, the shapes with soft edges are extremely valuable for creating base shapes that don't rely on hard edges. Hard edges can be added to a shape with a negative sculpt, but they cannot be removed. So it's always better to start a base shape with soft edges and add the edges intentionally. There are some cases where the shapes with hard edges are useful for creating base shapes, but only when those hard edges are intentional to the shape that you're creating. I'll talk a little bit more about using the soft shapes as part of my 3D sculpting and 2D sculpting workflows, but I wanted to get that out of the way because it's very important to organize the shapes in this way in your mind. Part 5, Texturing. Texturing in Dreams is a pretty simple idea, but because of many tools and ideas that have been developed by the community, texturing is actually pretty robust. I'm going to share some of the texturing tools and tricks that I use, but I would recommend that you learn from other sculptors, specifically Saku's Mind, who does a lot of texturing tricks, because he has a much better idea of texturing. I'm not as experienced with texturing as some other sculptors, but I'll get into some of the tricks that I use for texturing. First of all, Surface Snap is very useful for texturing. It's very nice to have your shapes just snapped straight to the surface for you. Much easier to work. Now I'll talk about some of the shape combinations. Specifically, we'll start with spray paint. Another important part about texturing are these wheels that are given to us. Basically, when you select them, it will change the color as you spray paint. Many of these are given to you, one for each color, for red, orange, yellow, and so on. But you can also make custom wheels. The way that you do that is you press touchpad. That brings up the color wheel. Then you can pick colors of any kind, and you can combine them in this circle that says under it, Mix. To do that, select a color, hold down R2 from Pure, and drag it over to Mix. Then you can hold down R2 on the mix and flick it around, and then you have a changing color wheel that was custom created. If you take out a hexagon and you add a hole to the hexagon, then you can resize the hexagon by stretching it instead of using the up arrow key. The reason this is good is that you can make a very thin line with the hexagon. Then you can shrink it down to make it even thinner. And you can do this multiple times if you want to make the effect even more pronounced. And now I have this very, very tiny shape that has some edges to it. Then I can flick the touchpad on the controller, and then I have this unique texturing. All those hard edges create some very interesting patterns, and so this is one of the texturing tools that I use. It just adds a lot of interest, and you can always tone it down, spray paints that have low opacity, so that you can make the effect less pronounced. And it's great for texture of different kinds. A similar trick to the hexagon trick is, instead of using a hexagon, you can use a sphere and add the hole, stretch out the sphere as many times as you'd like, and then resize it down. This creates a similar texture, but there's no hard edges with this one. Another tool is use a sphere without a hole, stretch it to be very tall, resize down, and stretch it tall one more time, and then resize down. You can use stay upright in combination with surface snap here to get a long line that snaps to the surface. And when you spray paint with that, it will create an interesting effect on the surface. Great for wood textures, and a variety of other things as well. That's all the texturing that I'm going to share about spray paint here. Again, you should look up Saku's Mind and other sculptors who have a bunch of different techniques, and check out their streams because they have a lot of interesting ways of texturing. There's also texturing that affects the actual surface of the shape that you're texturing. And it can add a little bit of extra believability to the texture. Smear is great for creating textures that actually affect the shape that you're working with. There's a similar trick to the one that I just showed, where you can take a sphere, stretch it tall, resize, and stretch tall again. And resize one more time. And then, with surface snap on, you can create a similar effect. As you can see, it looks a little different when it's actually the shape. There, I use positive shapes, but you can also use negative shapes, and they look different. There, I used a positive shape to create the texture, but here you can use a negative as well. And they have their own different ways of looking. This last technique is actually my favorite for texturing, and I incorporate it into most textures that I do. Start out with a sphere, make it negative, increase the hole to the maximum, and then stretch out the sphere. Shrink the sphere down, stretch it out again, and shrink it down again. You can do this a third time if you want, but it's not necessary. Then I flip the touchpad, and I start smearing. You can do this smear with the same color as the base shape, you can do it with a different color, anything you want. But the fun part comes next. Now, when you cut into the shape with some stamps, you can see that a lot of texture has been created inside the actual sculpt. So you can create some interesting textures that way too. Additionally, you can then use soft blend to soften the effect of this texturing. So you can create points of interest in any way that you want. Great for rock textures, because rocks have different points where there's lots of texture, and then it has like different points where there's less. So yeah, that's one of my favorite texturing methods. That's it for texturing. Like I said, there's lots of different techniques, but these are the ones that are my favorites, so these are all I'm going to show for this tutorial. Part 6, my 3D sculpting workflow. Typically when sculpting, you'll have a reference image. This reference image was created by Pudazuka on Dreams. Now I'm going to try to use this 2D image to sculpt something in 3D. The first thing I do when sculpting anything is I make sure that the mirror and kaleidoscope is appropriate for what I'm sculpting. In this example, I'm sculpting a dog. And dogs have symmetrical faces, so I have to make sure that the mirror is correct. The first step in the workflow is to fill space with large, soft edge shapes that have the appropriate blend settings. And I just block out the space that I need to cover. I don't worry about specific details and specific edges of the shapes. I just get a general block out of the shape, making sure to use soft edges so that there's not any unintended sharp corners. When I'm blocking out the base shape, I make sure to use the correct colors because it's hard to color things precisely, so you'll save some time if you pick the colors while doing the base shape blockouts. Then I use some smaller shapes that are soft blended together, and I multi-clone them to get the more specific details between the shapes. Maybe I need to add some lines where the cheeks are, maybe I need to add some more variance in the ears, or maybe a tail. Something like that, where it's a very small but important shape difference. I also use soft blended shapes for this, and I use shapes with soft edges. And then, after I'm done with all of that, then I add any hard edges that do exist in the shape. I think it's good to add the hard edges at the end because it's an intentional choice. Then I would do the texturing, coloring, and stuff like that. And then for any detail work, I would add either a new sculpt, or I would sculpt on top of everything that I already have that has all the hard edges, all the coloring, all the texturing. It's important to do texturing before you add any more layers of sculpture, because once you place sculpture pieces down, it's hard to texture without unintentionally texturing parts of the sculpture that you didn't want to affect. And I'd just like to say that this sculpture was thrown together, so of course it's not going to look very good, but I hope it helps show the idea of the workflow to you. Part 7, my 2D sculpting workflow. Sculpting can also happen in 2D by cutting 3D sculptures flat. So I also have a workflow for that. Just like with 3D sculpting, I fill space with large, soft blended, soft edge shapes. This time though, they have to be aligned on grid, at least on one plane, so that you can cut them flat. Now, it's important to remember when doing the block out with 2D shapes that you don't want to worry about overlap on the Z axis, because you're going to cut it flat anyway. What you really want to think about is, what does the cross section look like? When I cut this in half, is the outer edge going to look right? So I really am looking at the silhouette around the shape, more so than the way that the shapes interact with each other. So it is allowed to look really messy from that perspective, as long as the outer shape is the base shape that you're going for. I talked about clipped mirror in part 3, the guides, and I think this is a great example of a use case for clipped mirror. Let me show you. So as you can see in this sculpture, it creates a hard edge where you need it because of the way that clipped mirror works. And when you're sculpting in 2D, you can get away with some pretty wacky things. As you can see, I just used a soft blended shape just to affect the outline. And although the geometry is completely messed up, because the only thing I have to worry about is the slice down the middle, I'm allowed to get away with it. And I was able to change the silhouette. And this is a great example of using negative shapes to create hard edges, and intentionally, instead of having the hard edges from the start. Once you're done with the large, soft blended shapes to get the base shape blocked out, then I make the first cut to see what it looks like in 2D. The way that I like to cut things flat is I create a negative shape, put it on grid, and I place it straight in the middle of the plane that I considered when I was sculpting. Then I stamp it, clone one to the other side, and then I use the stretch tool to make sure it's lined up so that on either end of the middle I get enough width so that it's still visible. So I go all the way down to 1 out of 32 grid size, grab it so that it aligns to the grid, move it out 1, grab the other side that it aligns to the grid, and then move it out 1 or 2 pieces. And then we have a 2D sculpture. Even after you cut, you can still make more shapes, and then you can just cut again. Just make sure it's aligned on grid properly. So you make your adjustment, you cut again, and then you can use negative sculpts to fix any errors that arose from the added shapes. Then I do the coloring and textures. Thank you for watching this tutorial. I hope it was informative and helpful to you, and happy dreaming.